Okay. I guess first off, any questions or stuff to bring up? Okay, I guess not. What I want to do is I'm going to do sort of a show and tell, because one, these pictures are quite rare. Then also, I think it's important to understand, most of you've gone over and looked at that yellow peril stuff, and also the Japanese American family, and trying to figure out how things are different here and how they're the same in the US mainland is sort of hard, unless, like many things, you go back into history, because a huge part of everything is based in what was. And this is sort of a combination of two things, but the main part has to do with the geographic location of Hawaii, which is unique. We're the only island mass with for example, a harbor or harbors in the middle of the North Pacific. And secondly, the technology of the 19th, 20th centuries, in fact, even 21st, I guess. Here we see a picture of a German, what was called protected cruiser or trade cruiser, sometimes called China cruisers. This is 1914. She's interned in Honolulu Harbor, and I'll get into that in a second. But the key thing about this is the technology from basically 1850 to 1920 was of steam power. So if you think of, like, choo-choo trains, that was the locomotives with the guys shoveling the coal into the burner of the locomotive. Same thing with ships. So what you had is a huge part of the ship was basically coal, carrying huge amounts of coal. And there are literally guys that 24/7 would shovel that coal into these huge furnaces that they basically would run the ship, and that's the smoke coming out the top. And that's how you got around. Now, one of the problems you get into really quickly is coal is a very inefficient form of energy. I think even in modern terms, the HECO power plant, which till a couple of years ago was coal-driven, coal, you only get about 15 or 20%, maybe it's 15% of the energy out of the coal, which means you have to load a hell of amount of coal and set it afire to basically get any heat at all. The advantage is that it was uncomplicated to use, and that's why it's the first of your sort of steam technologies is coal-fired, and so that's what everyone did. Now, as long as you were just putting around in an area, say from San Francisco, LA, or something like that, it's not a problem. The minute you start to go long distances, you have to remember, you have to pack, maybe 150, 200 people in this thing. You've got to have food, you got to have water. In this case, it's a warship, so you got to have guns, ammunition, all the other stuff you got to have. And you got to figure out a place to put all that coal. And if you get all the coal you want in here, for example, this thing was going to go from China to, well, let's say it's going to go from Germany to China. And you put enough coal in it to get it to China from Germany, it would sink. You couldn't put enough coal in this boat to get it that far. So it's sort of like your car. If you have your car and for some reason you go to the mainland and you load a tank of gas and you decide you're going to drive to New York from LA, you ain't going to do it on one tank of gas. And gasoline is much more energy efficient than coal was. So the problem that they had basically is the technology allowed them to basically get around with coal. But your distance was about maybe 1,500, 2,000 miles. Anything above that, it gets really sketchy. In that context, all of a sudden, and this is 1850 on, Hawaii becomes hugely important, because if you're on the west coast of North America, whether it be Canada, the US, Mexico, whatever, then 2,500 miles gets you to Hawaii. But if you're going to go to Asia, it's another 4,000 to 5,000 miles. So you can't go from San Francisco to Japan. You can't go from San Francisco to China. You have to find someplace in between to refuel. And that's why the US Navy in 1878 is the big push for the US government to sign a treaty with the Hawaiian monarchy to set up a coaling station at Pearl Harbor. And it very explicitly was that the US military would pay to bring in large piles of coal, pile them up at Pearl Harbor. Well, it was Pearl Locks then. And basically that's where they would stash their stuff, and their ships would stop there and refuel. Now, the other thing the US made very clear is that's for US only. So the British, the French, everyone else who had a presence in the Pacific wouldn't be allowed to stop there, which suddenly meant if you were almost anyone else in the Pacific, you couldn't go into the North Pacific because there was no place to fuel up. So the United States, in a very clever move, basically shut down the entire North Pacific to anyone else because of the limits of the technology and of energy at the time. And that's why about 5 years later, when they break the reciprocity treaty, Congress does. So they break the treaty they made with the Hawaiian monarchy in terms of, we'll let you sell stuff like sugar in the United States for no tax, but we need the coaling station at Pearl Harbor. When they reneged on their part of it and they started taxing Hawaiian goods into the United States, they illegally kept the coaling station literally at gunpoint. And the monarchy didn't have any troops, so the monarchy couldn't take it back. Even though the United States wasn't a big military then, there was no way that the Hawaiians could deal with it. And it was just sort of another nail in the monarchy in terms of it being ineffective, that it couldn't even protect its own property against foreign takeover, which is true. I mean, the Kalakaua couldn't. There was no way to do it, and and people were very ambivalent about it. But the general consensus was the United States were a bunch of jerks, because they kept this property they had made promises to, reneging entirely on their half of the promises, keep what they want. So right from the get-go, one of the main reasons Hawaii is of interest to the United States has to do with the U.S. Navy. It's not the sugar guys here. The sugar guys here want to be of interest to the United States and want to sell stuff in the United States. But you have to remember, by the late 19th century, the United States is a huge country with a ton of people, and Hawaii is sort of like this afterthought. There's nothing in Hawaii that's that important, except for the U.S. military, specifically the U.S. Navy. The coaling, the ability to refuel in Honolulu makes us one of the most strategically important places on the entire planet. The British equivalent is Singapore, and it's for the very same reason. Now, what that means is this is one of the main impetuses, for example, in 1893, when the insurrectionists talked the council and the U.S. Navy into supporting the insurrection at gunpoint. The reason they're able to do that is because the commodore in charge of the U.S. military ships, the Naval Squadron in Honolulu, realized the absolutely total strategic importance of the coaling station. In fact, that's why the United States kept ships here, is to protect it. So we were already, even before we were part of the United States, we were already one of the most important strategic locations in the world for the United States, but not the Hawaiian Islands. Pearl Harbor and that pile of coal, which is actually, if you want to think about it, if you're next time you fly out of Honolulu Airport, it's at the end of Hickam Air Base. There's even little bits of coal left there. So that was the coaling station. Hugely important because of the technology. And it also aced everyone else. It had two advantages. One, you had it, and two, you didn't have to share. You could make, basically cut everyone else out of the game. That's also the main push in 1898, 1899 for Hawaii to become part of the United States. And in fact, the US government tells the Hawaiian Republican government, which was sort of flip-flopping on whether they really wanted to be part of the United States by then. They basically tell them, you don't have any choice. We are declaring war on Spain, or in fact, they had declared war on Spain. We have already taken over the Philippines, which they had, and we're not only gonna keep Pearl Harbor, whether you want it or not, but we're gonna take over the Hawaiian Islands because we need you for strategic purposes. So you can either come here voluntarily, or you're gonna come here because we make you come here, but you do not have a choice of not joining up. And so that's when we become a territory, it's a very ambivalent situation here, even for the guys, ironically, that 6 years earlier had set up the insurrection for the purpose of being part of the United States. Things had changed so much in that 6-year period that almost everyone was sort of like, I'm not too sure about this one. And so it's largely the Navy and coal technology that makes this one of the most critical locations, to the extent the United States, one, is not going to give the sucker up unless the United States wants to go back to being a purely continental country. And two, they're going to spend, tons of money making sure they keep it. So from basically 1906 on, the United States starts to build these enormous fortifications around the island of Oahu for the sole purpose of protecting the coaling station in Pearl Harbor. They then build docks and other stuff at Pearl Harbor to repair the ships while they're refueling them. And so that becomes the reason for Pearl Harbor's existence, is coal. But it actually shapes American foreign policy and American attitude towards Hawaii. We are never part of the United States. Pearl Harbor is part of the United States in sort of the American mindset, right into 1941 and December 7th. So the United States is already pouring money into this. At the same time, the United States is very sensitive to the fact that as the world is shrinking, and as the European powers have taken over everything else in the Pacific and largely in Asia, that everyone is sort of looking with this big eye at Hawaii and sort of thinking, I wonder, maybe we should take it. The British made a few noises about, having something to do with Hawaii and got their fingers bit off. The French really wanted to, but couldn't figure out how to. The Germans in the late 19th century had taken over much of the Western Pacific, including almost all of Micronesia. And in that context, they had built a very large economic system in Asia and the Pacific. If you drink beer, you're probably most aware of it with the idea of Tsingtao, the Chinese beer company, which is in the port of Tsingtao, which was German. The Germans took over that part of China. That's why they make Pilsner beer there. That was a German brewery originally. So in that context, what you have is that by the early 20th century, the world has shrunk, and the United States has Hawaii and has Pearl Harbor, but they're sort of guarding it like this because they're really know, and they're totally accurate, that everyone else would love to take it from them. And so they're building up, spending enormous amounts of money, relatively speaking, on building up the defenses. And you can see this next time you go down to Waikiki. This is Fort DeRussy. Massive installations. Everything you see along the waterfront, that's Fort Kamehameha. If you go out to Kapolei region, there's Fort Barrett, which is a surrealistically huge underground thing that I think goes down 14 stories. And of course, most famous all is Diamond Head, which is just absolutely riddled with enormous amounts of stuff. I believe there's something like 14 miles of tunnels in Diamond Head. That's told me once. So I mean, and all this money was spent not to protect the folks in Hawaii, but to protect the U.S. naval interest in Pearl Harbor. So the rest of the U.S. government was disinterested in the Hawaiian Islands. So when we become a territory, they don't care what happens here. It's irrelevant to them. The only ones that are interested, the Department of Defense, I think it was called the War Department then, specifically the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Army is dragged into it because the U.S. Navy says you have to protect our naval base, and that's why they built Schofield. So the U.S. Army at Schofield and later Shafter and all this stuff, those installations, if you think about them, are actually like a protective fence around Pearl Harbor. And so the United States ends up spending actually a large part of its military expenditures before World War II and in the 1920s, and even during the Depression, on protecting and amplifying Pearl Harbor. So the military, not surprisingly in this context, becomes the major other presence in Hawaii by the late 19th century, even in the late monarchy and certainly in the Republic and certainly in the territory. The main people that actually, if you said hop, everyone jumped, were going to be guys in white outfits called admirals. They were not going to be civilians. The governor of Hawaii would never think during the territorial period of contradicting the U.S. Navy. So the U.S. Navy were the huge players. The plantation owners were way down the feeding chain. And none of the other U.S. government agencies, Interior Department, all the rest of those, they're irrelevant. They're not even on the charts. To a certain extent, you can still see this in Guam. The relationship with the U.S. military, specifically the Navy and related services in Guam, and the sort of disproportionate lack of other services, is actually a mirror of what Hawaii was until statehood in 1959. So in that context, that brings us into the 20th century. Now, you have to remember, if you hop forward a few years, we'll say 1904, 1905, and I mentioned, I think last time, the Japanese have gone from being a hidden place, almost like a closed closet. They now opened up and joined the rest of the world. In the space of less than 20 years, they go from being a strange place with people walking around with swords called samurai to one of the world's larger and probably fastest growing at the time military powers, literally out of nowhere. And no one took them seriously until 1904, because when someone said Asia, and you have to remember, most of you go to the mainland, you'd click the box that would be called Asian. They're not going to care whether you're Filipino or Okinawan or Korean or Japanese or whatever. As far as they're concerned, it's Asian. Asian until the early 20th century was Chinese to Americans and Europeans. China was the only part of Asia they understood. They'd read Marco Polo or something like that. So if you were anything, they didn't care if you were Japanese or Korean or whatever. As far as they were concerned, you're basically Chinese. And that's why the Yellow Peril stuff we saw was an anti-Chinese movement. One, there were stereotypes about Chinese. Two, there were some of those stereotypes where the Chinese were very hard workers, but they were really strange and like you saw in those videos. And so therefore you could segregate against them. But also to a certain extent, you're sort of afraid of them, because if they really wanted to, the Chinese might have the ability to be competitive. And that was the huge fear, for example, in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe. If you allowed too many Chinese in, they might take over because they were such hard workers and they were smart. So you didn't want to cut them too much slack. They want to constantly slap them down, and that's the reason for the anti-Chinese movements in the mainland US. Now, Japanese weren't seen in that. I mean, to a certain extent, if you asked most mainland Americans till 1905, they would have said they're all Chinese. They didn't know, didn't care. In 1904, what happens is the Chinese have been expanding. They've been expanding largely in terms of taking over territory, and a lot of the territory was China. They crash into the Russians, the Imperial Russia, whole thing of Siberia. And the two of them get into this absolutely massive war in 1904 and 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Now, everyone else is sort of watching this thing like they'd watch a tennis match or something like that. Yeah, you know, these two places are getting into it. But all the money was on the Russians to absolutely just kick the Chinese or kick the Japanese butts. And the reason was, of course, that a basic stereotype was that the Russians were Europeans. And the European armies and the European navies were just by obvious definition going to be better than some little guys coming from Asia that had just, you know, figured out how to fire a gun 20 years ago and run around with swords in many cases still. And so everyone just sort of thought it was sort of like a goofy, almost like a comedy routine. And the question was, how many days would it take the Russians to beat the Japanese, you know, completely out of the system? Within a year, the Japanese not only wiped out 2 Russian armies, but they wiped out 3 Russian navies, or more accurately, 3 Russian fleets. They basically wiped out the entire Russian Navy, both the Navy in Asia and the Navy in Europe, which then sails over to Asia to rescue them. They both get their clocks cleaned. And they do it with almost no casualties. They basically massacre a huge Russian fleet off of Japan at the Straits of Tsushima in 1905. They sink everything and lose nothing, basically. And the whole world is totally stunned, especially the United States. The Europeans, to a certain extent, but they didn't see Asia as being near them. The United States is still starting to look across the Pacific, especially because the United States controls Guam and the Philippines, and Japan isn't that far. They hadn't taken the Japanese seriously until all of a sudden 1904, 1905, and the Japanese just kicked butt. And all of a sudden, especially the Americans, this huge sort of, you know, red flashing light goes off, and they go, holy crap, these guys are for real. They still don't really believe it. They basically blame the Russians for being inept and stupid. But nonetheless, the Japanese wiped them out, and you got to give them some creds for that. And so their view of the Japanese suddenly goes from, you know, something real trivial pursuits, sort of like, yeah, look at these weird people in a weird part of the world, like you'd see on some, you know, Discovery Channel show. And now all of a sudden they're talking about these, yeah, you know, the Japanese have a lot of ships. The Japanese have a really first-class army. The Japanese are kicking butt, you know, like, what the hell? And so all of a sudden the United States starts to freak out. And their huge new fear, sorry, about Pearl Harbor is the Japanese might want it. And I think to a certain extent, there was also a fair amount of guilty conscience because they had rolled the Japanese into this anti-Asian thing. And so they had totally crapped on Japanese in the United States in every which way possible. It just rolled into this anti-Asian thing. If you were Japanese in many states, including California, you couldn't own property, but it was the same as the Chinese. And if something juns on you could do that to the Chinese people in the United States because the Chinese government was inept and basically didn't exist. But all of a sudden, it's like 1905, 1906, 1907. If you're doing that to Japanese, you're looking around, dude, these guys might be able to kick our butt. So maybe we shouldn't pick on them so much, or at least that's option one. Option one is, well, we're just going to be really afraid of their military and be paranoid about it, but we're still going to, you know, give them a hard time in the United States. The United States opts for option number 2. And they just sort of piddle along with this, being every year becoming more and more concerned about the Japanese as a military political force in the world. But at the same time, not really taking them serious. I think it's sort of like the United States attitude towards China till maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah, they're there. Yeah, they've got this. But yeah, those guys, they're never going to get their shit together. They're not really serious. And all of a sudden when it happens, everyone's like, holy crap, where'd these guys come from? And now there's this huge, you know, press the panic button. What are you going to do with the Chinese? Same thing occurred almost exactly 100 years ago, ironically. Now, this all came to a head in 1914. In 1914, World War I's declared. Now, as you might know if you remember your world history, whenever you took that, the United States stays out of World War I. The United States doesn't declare war on either side. The United States decides to remain neutral. The Japanese had very close ties to England, which goes back to the late 19th century. And so when the British and the French and everyone declare war on Germany and stuff, the Japanese jump in on the British side. I think they declare war like the 2nd or 3rd day it happens. Now, they do this for very opportunistic reasons. The first thing they do is they take over all the German colonies in the Pacific and Asia. So they take over Tsingtao, they take over Micronesia, they take over everything the Germans had that wasn't bolted down, so they start flying the Japanese flag. So they do it for very, you know, practical reasons. But they also spend a fair amount of manpower and send a fair number of ships to help the British out, who are, you know, pretty stretched. I mean, there was a good chance the Brits were going to lose the war. So the Japanese actually, you know, they put money in the game. They just didn't sit there and sort of watch from the sidelines. Now, in all this, of course, the Americans are watching from the sidelines. And the Americans really, you have to remember, until 1916, the United States couldn't decide if it was going to come in on the side of Germany, if it was going to come in on the side of the Brits. There's a huge amount of pro-German attitude in the United States. And this is also true in 1941 with the Nazi Germans. The largest Nazi movement in the world was in the United States outside of Germany and Sweden. So you know, the Germans were integral part of the American attitude of who they were. Ironically, if you went back 70 years earlier, Germans were distant when they migrated to the United States. But by the early 20th century, they were seen in some ways as sort of quintessential American value group. And so in that context, Americans are flip-flopping. Now, you have to remember, in this context, Hawaii is a territory, and the only one that's interested in Hawaii is the U.S. military, the Navy. 1914 happens, the United States is neutral. Now, the Japanese have, I think at that time, maybe the world's fourth largest Navy, and it's probably the most modern Navy in the world, actually. The Germans had a few ships, many of them pretty goofy. They were just like puttering around. World War I starts, and you have to remember, there's radio is very poor. There's no telecommunications in the modern sense. So all that happens is, telegraphs go out and say, okay, World War I's been declared, and if you're one of the German ships in the Pacific, you go, crap. And you basically have to do one of two things. Either you have to get back to Germany, or if you can't do that, you find a neutral place. And it's sort of like if you used to play tag when you were a kid, and if you touch the pole, you're safe. If you could get to a neutral country, you could park in their harbors, and the other guys couldn't get you. If you were found in the Pacific, the Japanese made it very clear, since they were pretty much running the Pacific, that they were going to sink you. So if you're a German ship, it's just like, turning on a light and the cockroaches scatter. They're just disappearing, trying to find a place to hide. And one of the places to hide becomes Honolulu. Now what we see is about 2 months after the war started, this is Honolulu Harbor. In fact, this is what's now Pier 2. That's where the cruise ships are tied up. In fact, there's one tied up there now. This is a very small German China cruiser, was called the Geyer. Steam powered. So literally, even if she took coal on here, she couldn't get back to Germany. So she's pretty much trapped in the Pacific. She's now been here a couple of months. You can see laundry literally hanging from here, which is not something military ships normally do. So she's stuck here. She's what they call interned. Okay. Now, the German ships came here. The Japanese have been keeping track of them before the war started, because everyone knew World War I was going to start. It was just a matter of, like what day. And so in that context, what happened here? Let me get switch pictures. Okay, I'm not sure why that happened. So in that context, the Japanese were waiting for these guys. And let's see if I can find the picture. Oh, here we go. The Japanese were literally right behind them. You could do actually a pretty good movie of this stuff. So the German ships got here. I think there were 6 cargo ships or freighters, whatever you want to call them. And then there was that little tiny, goofy cruiser. Here's the German merchant ships all tied up in Honolulu Harbor. So they're here, they're safe. They've touched the pole. A Japanese naval squadron parks itself offshore. Now this is totally illegal. This is one of the Japanese cruisers. It's literally state of the art. She was only like 4 or 5 years old. The United States Navy had nothing in the Pacific to actually deal with this. The United States Navy was pretty much in the Atlantic. So there was nothing in the whole Pacific Ocean that could take this puppy on. She wasn't even the biggest of them. The big Japanese ships were half again larger. So this thing is literally a state-of-the-art armored cruiser. She could sink everything in this harbor in about 5 minutes if she felt like it. She's supposed to be 10 miles offshore, but if she's not, if you think about it, these guys here can literally throw a rock and hit the beach. They intentionally break American neutrality and come cruising back here. The commodore of the Japanese squadron, sends in a bunch of, sort of text to basically the Germans saying, come out and have a fight, which, they're not that stupid. But he also tells the U.S. Navy, he tells the territorial governor here, that unless the United States throws the Germans out, he's going to come in and take them. And he's going to do that by shelling Honolulu Harbor too. So the Japanese basically say, we're not leaving without these guys. Here it gives you an idea what one of these ships are. They're absolutely massive suckers. Literally state-of-the-art massive armored warships. And the United States is the thing, I think, had 2 little ships about the same size as the German one. They would have lasted for about 30 seconds against these guys. And there's 4 of them. There's 4 of these monsters just sitting off there like giant tigers or something like that, just waiting for something to happen. And they literally have their guns for much of the time trained on Honolulu. And given the fact that it took roughly 14 days for ships to get here from the West Coast, the United States in a panic tries to scratch together something and send it out here to protect the port, Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, from Japanese takeover, because it very quickly dawns on them if the Japanese take over Honolulu, they can take over the Hawaiian Islands. And because the United States is neutral, the United States can't ask for the help of the British or other groups we had treaties with, for the very simple reason that we hadn't joined World War I. So the United States in 1914 has no friends because we decided not to join the groups that we had treaties with for whatever set of reasons. So all of a sudden the United States falls into an absolute panic. And now remember, the main thing is not so much what's going on, it's who's doing it. These are the little guys out of Asia that everyone didn't take seriously. And all of a sudden everyone remembers 10 years ago, these guys and their sister ships blew the crap out of the entire Russian Navy with very little effort. And now they're taking on Pearl Harbor, and the Americans have got absolutely nothing to stop them. And so what happens is all of a sudden in the space of roughly 24 hours, the Japanese go from a sort of exotic, interesting, trivial pursuit thing that again would be in a history show documentary, to all of a sudden the thing that's in the closet banging on your door at 2 in the morning, scaring the crap out of you. And they're the same guys. Okay. So the United States goes from these guys are silly or bizarre to these guys are absolutely terrifying. And so what happens is the Japanese become the huge ogres, the huge nightmare of the early 20th century to the American Navy. And that has, this is this. Now the Commodore actually, for whatever it's worth, gets told to sort of back off a little bit, but it says something about the aggression the Japanese were doing at the time. That he actually captures this little boat. This is coming up from Samoa. I can't remember the name of it, but she's coming up from Samoa. She's carrying coconut, copra. So she was saying that she was trying to get into Honolulu before everyone else did, but she was running under sails. There's no way in God's green earth. These things could do like 25, 30 miles an hour. There's no way in God's green earth, she can do about 5. So she gets nailed about 40 miles outside of Honolulu. The Japanese take her. Now what they do, just to teach everyone a lesson, to remind the United States of what they can do, is they go and I think, here she is. They go, I think the 6th or 7th day they're here, they literally tow her out. They take the crew off. They tow her out about, I don't know, about 4 miles offshore, right off of what would be basically a Magic Island off there. And they use her for target practice, and they sink her in about, I don't know, a couple of minutes. And so all of a sudden, during the meal, they tell everyone they're going to do, and they just go there and blow the bejesus out of her. And all of a sudden, there's a ship literally in flames sinking, just reminding everyone. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, it didn't pop up, and that's odd. Okay. See, I don't understand why that's happening. Okay, wait a second. Time out here. I forget this all sorted out. Okay, now you should be able to see it. Okay. I don't know why the other one wasn't switching back and forth. Anyway, so here's the Japanese ship I was talking about. And here's what they were doing. Here's the intimidation. Now, about 4 days after this picture was taken, because of course this was huge national news in the United States, was, what the hell was going on? So, the United States didn't know what to do. The Japanese were pro-British. The Americans were generally more pro-British than pro-German, but here the Japanese were literally willing to take the United States on. And it was pretty obvious that the main reason was, taking Honolulu or Pearl Harbor would be a huge strategic move for the Japanese. And I think it was probably the first wake-up call to the United States that you might not be able to stay neutral in this war. I really think they thought that it was a European war and these guys would just blow each other off. And then, a couple of years later, it'd be pow, the United States could go being friends with everyone. They just thought they could ignore it. And this basically made it clear, dude, it don't happen. It's the 20th century. This is a global war. It's World War I. The Japanese were the ones that really poked that stick in the American eye. And it's these ships that did that at Pearl Harbor, not the mainland United States. So the United States were sort of in an ambivalent situation. If the Japanese were going to do this in San Francisco, it would have been a war. If they're doing it in a territory, which the United States had only taken over under pretty questionable situations less than 15 years earlier, then it's really the United States thinking, yeah, man, do we really want to get into a world war over Hawaii? Over one military base? Man, I don't know. That's really sort of, that's sort of a leap. And so the United States was stalling out. And the Japanese knew that. The Japanese were incredibly aggressive in this period, and they thought they had the upper hand. They thought they were the better poker player, and they basically do that by taking the sucker out and sinking it, and making sure they have photographers taking pictures, making sure the Americans have photographers taking pictures, so everyone knew within 10 minutes that this boat didn't exist anymore. And they basically then tell the Germans, you bring your boats out, we're going to do the same thing to you. And they tell the Americans, you don't make the Germans come out, and we're going to do the same thing to you. And you know, there's no context of any way to deal with this thing. It is basically almost like an alien ship landing on Earth. You can't touch it. You've got nothing to deal with this mother. So in that context, this becomes this radically changes from that moment on till when World War II starts in, well, basically 1936, when World War II starts with Japan. This episode is the thing that reshapes everyone's minds about the Japanese. And so it's critically important because the US military has to deal with the Japanese as a nightmare factor and take them seriously after these events in 1914, which all occurred literally offshore of Pearl Harbor, not in the mainland United States. Now, what this does in the mainland American view is it sort of keeps Hawaii in this exotic area. The mainland United States never really grasped that Hawaii is part of the United States. They do in sort of a vague way, but they don't really think it as anything serious or anything really legit. It's just sort of out there. And even more so in some weird ways, I suppose maybe this exacerbated that because this was happening in an exotic part of the world. It sort of belonged to the United States, but it wasn't part of the United States. And for, I think, a fair number of the population of the US mainland even today, they don't really see Hawaii as being part of the United States as being in the same way that, say, California or Idaho or Louisiana is. And that's, you know, this was on one hand the wake-up call, but for the US mainland, what it is, it shifted the yellow peril stereotype from the Chinese, who were not players in global affairs by 1914, and Japan becomes the new fear. Now, eventually, in 1917, the United States eventually backs into World War I just about a year before it ends. And World War I ends in 1918 with the Japanese and the Americans on the same side. But ever since 1914, in this episode, the United States had decided that Japan was sooner or later going to do a number on the US. And so the major impetus in the United States military after 1915, or well, actually it's after World War I, is these are the guys we're going to fight next. Japan is going to be the country we're going to have to go to war with. And all the American military plans after that are based on Japan. And what that means, among other things, is you pump enormous amounts of resources and stuff into Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor is going to be the staging point so that you can fight the Japanese off of the Philippines, which was the plan. And not surprisingly, from the Japanese standpoint, it becomes real obvious, well, we almost took this place in 1914. If we bomb the bejesus out of it in 1941, we can stop that entire American thing just by putting a cork in it, which is why they attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a perfectly logical thing to do. From the Japanese standpoint, it made absolutely perfect sense. From the American standpoint, the American military standpoint, it wasn't actually a huge surprise. They just didn't think the Japanese could do it, which goes back to the same stereotypes they'd had when they were so shocked with these guys. Somehow they never learned the fact that the Japanese surprised them because they were actually more sophisticated and more technologically superior than they thought they were going to be, until this thing showed up and scared everyone in 1914. Same thing happens in 1941. It never occurred to the Americans the Japanese could actually make an attack on Pearl Harbor. But even then, it's remember Pearl Harbor, not remember Hawaii or remember Oahu or remember Honolulu, even though a bunch of other places were bombed. Pearl Harbor becomes the locus of that and still is. That's why the millions of people a year go visit the Arizona Memorial. It's Pearl Harbor that becomes central in the American mindset. And in part, at least, the initial foundation of that was this 1914 incident. Now, one of the side effects of all this then, and just sort of, because that picture sort of gives you the time we're talking about, is that the Japanese government was not an innocent player in all this. The Japanese government were the ones that set that squadron up. The Japanese government were players. The Japanese government wanted to control the Pacific. The Japanese government wanted the United States stuck on the West Coast. And they did everything they could to make that happen. And in their view, rather cleverly, what they did is they actually tried to tap the Japanese population in places like Hawaii and convince them that they were still Japanese. So the Japanese government went to huge lengths in the 20s and 30s specifically to get Japanese who'd migrated to Hawaii maybe even 30, 40 years earlier to keep their Japanese citizenship or renew their Japanese citizenship. And they also encouraged Japanese who had married Japanese, in other words, who had Japanese families, to send their kids to Japan to be educated as true Japanese. Now, the government did this purely cynically because the government knew, given what I mentioned last time, that those folks were never going to be treated as Japanese. And Japanese who were born, had been in Hawaii for 30 years, who are Japanese citizens, would never be accepted as Japanese back home. In fact, the Japanese government, ironically, didn't accept their citizenship. It may have wanted them to be citizens, but it didn't actually accept it. What it did is it wanted the Americans to be freaked out about the Japanese in the United States. Their attitude is the more the Americans crapped on Japanese in the United States, the more this yellow peril thing was amped up, the more the Japanese government could then justify their behavior in the Pacific. So the Japanese government basically set a scenario up to do everything they could to pour fuel on the fire of yellow peril nationalism and yellow peril and racism in the United States. And one of the very clever ways, from their standpoint, to do that was to amplify and advertise the number of folks who were of Japanese ancestry, who had Japanese citizenship, which of course to the Americans was seen as folks saying, I don't want to be an American. So there's always geopolitics in this stuff. Now in the US mainland, what that does is that puts Japanese, as you saw if you watch that Japanese American family, that puts them in the scenario that they're in. That isn't covered in that video, because that video is looking at basically the World War II experience. But it is a part of that. It's sort of, once you understand that happened, if you go back and watch it again, I don't know why you guys would, but if you watch the first part again, you'll see that the narrator actually mentions in a couple of spots the folks that still had Japanese citizenship. In fact, that's why the dad, the one that eventually committed suicide, that's one of the main reasons he wasn't let out of prison, out of the concentration camp, was that he still had Japanese citizenship. And to the Americans, it played out exactly the way the Japanese government wanted to. Now, ironically, huge numbers of Germans and Italians in the United States still had German and Italian citizenship. But when World War II starts, they're seen in the same ambivalent way that they were seen in World War I. Because you have to remember, originally the Italians are on the side of the Germans, and then they switch. So, if you're white, if you're Hawai'i or Anglo, or well, actually Hawai'i American than Anglo, if you're physically visibly white and you're from Europe, they're going to cut you a lot of slack. If you're visibly Asian, then you're yellow peril. And that's why the incarceration order in 1941 by President Roosevelt. And one of the key things about all this, the reason I'm going into so much depth about that, is the fact that otherwise it's impossible to understand why, despite the incarceration factor, folks here weren't incarcerated. You had more Japanese and part Japanese here in the Hawaiian Islands than you had all the mainland United States. Over 100,000, basically there's only about 10,000 Japanese or Japanese Americans in the US mainland aren't put in concentration camps. Only less than 10,000 here were, which means that over 100,000 were not in concentration camps here. So it's literally the flip opposite. And yet there was a higher proportion of the population here that was Japanese that had Japanese passports and Japanese citizenship than the US mainland. So if you look at that actual data, if you look at that factual stuff and trying to figure out why the Japanese here were treated differently, you can't just say, oh, well, Hawaii was an accommodating place and, people got along better here. That's never been, we've been accommodating, but this is the United States and we're run by the military. So you got to ask yourself, why the hell would the military, who had just been bombed by Japanese here, be willing to cut Japanese here slack when they're the ones pushing to have all the Japanese in the mainland imprisoned and do so? And to do that, we have to get into something that's only probably very appropriate since we're working towards Halloween here, and that's 2 murder cases. Now, I think I sent you the links to some detailed stuff with that. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. They're absolutely fascinating cases if you're interested in legal history and just sort of legal affairs. And especially the second, the Massey case was, well, actually both of these were actually major cases, not only in their period, in other words, in the 20th century, but both of them in their own ways actually define US law. So if you take classes for example, in criminal law, both the Fukunaga and the Massey case come up as cases that you cite for precedents, if you're familiar with the legal system. So the first one's 1928. And what happens is, or I should say what's happening is Punahou. All of a sudden one morning, a guy comes up dressed as a driver, chauffeur, and he comes up to Punahou, which was even more so than it is today, a very elite school. It was still largely the upper crust of local society here. So it's the Kamainas that pretty much only went to Punahou. So this Japanese driver comes up to the front office and he says, I need to pick up Gil Jamieson. and I need to pick up this kid, one of the students at Punahou, because his mom's been in an accident. I'm supposed to take him to the hospital so the family can be there together. And the school goes, oh no, yeah, no problem. So I grab the kid, and the kid goes away with the driver. And it says something about society at the time that apparently no one, including the kid, looks at the driver and realizes they don't know who the driver is. It says something that if you're part of the elite combine and society here, that you wouldn't even know who your driver was. They were just guys in an outfit, which is pretty strange. Anyways, so the kid goes off with the driver. The actual driver shows up, and I will say arbitrary, 3 o'clock, whenever school's out. Driver shows up and wait for the kid. No kid. And so he, contacts the school and said, where's Jamieson? And the school says, well, you guys picked him up, 6 hours ago. I said, I didn't pick up anyone. So they immediately contact the family in a panic, and everyone starts running around in circles because the Jamieson family was very well connected. The Jamieson family, the head, the kid's dad, was actually one of the senior vice presidents for Hawaiian Trust Bishop Bank, which becomes First Hawaiian Bank eventually. So this guy was a power broker here. He was not only worth money, but he was in charge of money. So not surprising, this immediately everyone just starts running around and starts freaking out. Now you have to remember that crimes happened all the time here. It wasn't like this place was paradise. But someone abducting a kid at Punahou, of all places, in broad daylight, dressed as a driver driving a car, just everyone just like this was not what was supposed to happen. And the attitude was the combine elites were untouchable. They could kill each other, but no one was allowed to kill them from outside. And so what happens is everyone's freaking out, wondering what happens to the kid. A day or two later, I can't remember, you can go look at the article, a letter comes in signed the Three Kings. And it's sent to the newspaper. I think it was I can't remember if it was Advertiser or the Star. And basically it says it's a ransom note. If you pay, I don't know, say $10,000, we'll give you the kid back. If you don't, we're going to kill him. And so the family, not surprised they could come up with the cash. They immediately put the cash. This is one of the classic stereotypes, of the 20th century. They put the cash in a bag, and the bag's taken and dropping off, and the money disappears. So they're waiting for the kid doesn't show up. A couple of days after that, the kidnappers basically say, okay, we need more money. Cough more money up. Now, those of you involved in CJ or anything like this case, this is one of the precedent areas. The United States about 2 years earlier had started putting numbers on bills. Prior to that, there were no numbers. If you go back and you look at money from the early 20th century, it just was money. But if you notice after that, they started putting this little serial number, and each bill has a unique number on it. Because I maybe worked at the bank, I'm not sure why, it dawned on someone when they actually put out the first kidnappings thing to actually record the numbers on the bills. Now, it's a good bet that almost no one in Hawaii actually knew there were numbers on bill or paid any attention to them. But they actually had all the numbers. The bills were all numbered, and they had the numbers. And what they did is they went and sent the list of numbers around to all the different stores and stuff on the island of Oahu, and basically said, keep your eyes open for these numbered bills. I think they were $20 bills or something like that. And if you see any, contact the police. So the second ransom note goes out. They go and drop the ransom off, but it doesn't get picked up this time. I think that's what happened. And anyway, so everyone started to really freak out because the kid hasn't shown up and the money's been paid, and yet more money's being asked for. The second ransom note, the first one basically said this is just the first attack. So if you want to put it in our 21st century view of things, this was couched as a terrorist act. So these guys didn't see themselves as kidnappers in it for money. They saw themselves as kidnappers who were fighting for the freedom of Asians or something like that in Hawaii and the United States. So they're fighting against basically the Yellow Power movement. That's the way they couched it. So the second letter sent to the newspapers, who of course with typical journalistic whatever, immediately print the newspapers on the front page of their headlines, even before they give the ransom notes to the police. Journalistic ethics back in the early 20th century. And so what happens is that in that context, the second note even more so amplifies the fact that this is just the first attack. And there's going to be a lot more attacks like this against the Kama'aini elites here. Now, there's some great pictures, which I can never find. I know we scanned them, but I can't find them. I know they've got them at the archives. That if you go to the archives, website at DAGS, they've actually got pictures of the parents taking their kids to school, especially Ilani and Punahou, especially Punahou. And what you have is the day after the kidnapping, there's all these great pictures of these guys in cars. And I have to remember cars in this period like Model T Fords. They're you know, really retro. Well, they're old because that's 28. So there are a lot of places like stand and stuff on them. And so what you get is all these images of like, you know, a car with 2 or 3 kids inside and maybe 4 or 5 men with shotguns and rifles, you know, convoying the kids to school. And then they were also convoying them home. And what you also start to get is people starting to get shot. What happens is in 2 cases, people are shot. In 1 case, a lady's killed. An older Japanese lady is walking down the street at night, and someone decides that she's, you know, she's suspicious, and they just blow her off. So things went pretty nuts really, really quick. And it basically suddenly amplified for the first time something that people had known intuitively but hadn't thought about, especially the Kama'aina. And that's the fact that they were an incredibly small part of the population here. The Kama'aina were less than 1% of the population here, but controlled everything outside of the military. And there was basically at that point in time, probably 70-something% of the population was Asian. Another 15 or 17% of the population was Hawaiian. And then what you had left were Portuguese and stuff like that, and they sure weren't going to stand up for the Kama'aina. So what you had is the letters, the ransom notes, absolutely panicked everyone. They panicked the Kama'aina because they thought they could be true. They suddenly looked around and realized the guy mowing the lawn, the lady, the nanny taking care of the kids, all these folks were Asian. And so they suddenly sort of got a massive attack in what you might call Asian peril paranoia, just sort of popped literally overnight. And so, you know, they're shooting people, they're literally shooting. A guy almost kills his gardener mowing his lawn outside one afternoon because thinks the gardener's going to come and attack him. You know, another guy shoots his gardener because the guy's carrying a machete while the guy's trimming the plants. You use a machete. You know, I mean, people just went, their brains just switched off, and their paranoid level just went completely through the roof. Now, what did happen that sort of at one hand seems to sort of mitigate this is a place out, and I can't remember where, you have to go look at the article again. I'm going to say Wahiawa or Waialua, a little store out there, probably an old plantation store. They get a guy buying stuff with $20 bills. Now you have to remember, $20 at the time was a huge amount of money. That'd be like $1,000 bill today if they have $1,000 bills. And so, you know, and here's what there was this poor Japanese guy, and they were like, you know, how the hell can he afford a $20 bill? So they go and check, and sure enough, the numbers are on that list. So they call the cops. It says something about how paranoid Hawaii, especially Oahu, had gotten in the space of a few days. That the police, and you have to remember, this is still the sheriff's department. There's no HPD then. The sheriff's department, someone at the sheriff's department or somebody's, immediately tell the media that they've located the suspect. So they send a car out, and the cars drive over, and they pick the suspect up, a guy named Miles Fukunaga. They arrest him, I'm going to say again, Wahiawa or someplace. They bring him in. By the time the car gets back to Honolulu, which you have to remember would have taken a while because it was all 2-lane roads, there's a huge crowd in front of Iolani Palace. And you have to remember the Mackay side where the Cam statue is. That was actually this judiciary center. And so the sheriff's department was there. So where that turnaround was, and that's why that turnaround's there. So what happened is that's where the guys were going to pull in. This crowd actually has 2 or 3 ropes. It's not really very clear in the stories, hanging from those big banyan trees on the Mackay side and Iolani Palace side. And they basically stop the cops. They're trying to pull Fukunaga out of the car so they can hang him. Because as far as they're concerned, he's part of this terrorist movement, and they want him dead right now. And the cops, you know, to their credit, though I don't know who leaked the story, but the cops, to their credit, actually managed to get him inside and into the jail, which must have been a real trick because that was a lynch mob. And they made it very clear they were going to. In fact, the newspaper report the story and their basically theme is they can't understand why the sheriff's department actually took him into the jail. They said it would have been a lot easier to just give him up to the mob, let him hang him like a fruit in front of Iolani Palace. So that's the first part of the case. When they start to interview Fukunaga, they realize the guy's missing a few. He's not working with a full deck. He goes rambling on and on about getting messages from the devil or something like that. I can remember the whole story. And basically he's not really all here. His defense attorney, who's literally appointed as a public defender in the space of like a couple of hours, is given one short interview with him, and that's it. The attorney's given no time to build up a case. The prosecutor, i.e. the territorial government, basically wants to have this guy arraigned and tried within the next week. So they're going to take less than a week to do the entire thing. And of course, this is a murder verdict that they're looking at. Because one of the things he does tell right off the bat is that he had actually killed the kid the minute he took him from Punahou. And if you're really in a grisly mood and it's Halloween, if you cross the Macaulay Bridge, though I guess you can only do it virtually now, but if you do your Waikiki tour thing and you cross the Macaulay Bridge on the Mackay side of the bridge, the Waikiki side, if you were to look left towards the Waikiki Library, in other words, towards Diamond Head side, and you look down, there used to be a clump of kiawe trees there, and the kid was stuffed into there on the side of the Alawai Canal. So they literally found the kid, within 10 minutes of Fukunaga saying where he put the body. So the ransom stuff was he could never show the kid up because the kid was dead. And he said it again was the voice of the devil or something telling him what to do. The defense decides to use the insanity plea. The insanity plea had only started in American law a couple of months or a year earlier. No one had tried to use it yet. But the defense attorney basically figures he has no other choice. He tries to use the insanity plea. He gets a transcript of some of Fukunaga's ramblings and sends it around to the healthcare professionals, the mental health professionals here. And they all agree the guy's nuts. I'm not sure the politically correct term, but he's not with it. And so they actually write a petition saying that you cannot try this guy as an adult because he has no clue what the hell's going on. So you've got to use insanity as a judgment base. The territorial government and the judge ignore that. So this is the first use of the insanity plea, and it's basically ignored by the court and the jury. They find him guilty, and he's executed less than a week later. Now, that could have been the end of the Jamieson case because now the kid's been killed and the guy that killed him has been killed. And for the elites here, all of a sudden there's this huge sigh of relief because they realize, or at least the general consensus is, this guy was not part of some terrorist-based, politically driven movement, but it was one guy who was a nutcase. And so it's like, oh, good, so nothing was happening. Having said that, the irony is, though, the Kamaiani elites here think business is back to usual. For the rest of the population here, especially the Asian population, what they remember is sort of three things. One is how freaked out the Kamaiana got when they realized how few of them there were relative to everyone else. Two, how the Kamaiana were willing to kill or shoot anyone based on this paranoia without even using their brains for a second to think about what was going on. And three, the fact that they had absolutely no compunction about basically doing a lynch mob jury and executing the guy who obviously was not really, in his right mind, without even any discussion about, are there other mitigating, factors at play here? Now, what happened is one of the major newspapers at the time, though it was not read at all pretty much by Hawai'i, though it has an English language edition, still does today, was Hawaii Hochi. That was a largely Japanese language newspaper. It started on the plantations. By the 1920s, almost everyone who's Japanese, especially on Oahu, but also the outer islands, read it. So it was probably the third major publication there, along with the Star and the Advertiser. And for the Asian population, even folks that weren't Japanese, Chinese, for example, read it too. So for the Asian population, it was the only voice that talked about Hawaii from what I would call today locals, the local perspective, versus the Advertiser and the Star, who were basically run by Kamaiana interest and basically told the world from the Kamaiana point of view. So in that context, the editor of the Hochi, whose name always escapes me, actually started to print a series of editorials and articles where he started to actually list all the people that were being executed or killed who were Asian, or I should say being killed who were Asian, who were being killed by haoles, by especially the white elites, but all haoles in general, and how the carriage of justice was totally different if you were white killing someone who was Asian versus if you were Asian killing someone who was white. So what he was doing is contrasting the treatment that Fukunaga got versus the treatment that if you were haole and you killed someone who's Asian, what would be done to you? And there were two cases that became really central to this. One was a Japanese taxi driver was taking a fare down what's now Ala Boulevard, right downtown. And the fare gets into an argument with the driver, the guy who's in the taxi doesn't want to pay. So he gets out of the taxi. The driver says, "You got to pay me." The rider picks up a tire iron, beats the driver to death in the early evening, right there in the middle of Honolulu. The driver was Japanese. The passenger was Hawai'i. The guy's given assault and battery. He's given like 3 months in jail. Basically, almost no punishment for the unwarranted murder he did. A couple of months or after that, or around the same time, at the mill in Paia, a Hawai'i worker at the mill decides he doesn't like one of his Japanese or Asian, I think it's not even Japanese, one of the Asian co-workers, pours kerosene on him and lights him off right there in the middle of the mill during the middle of the work shift. Again, the guy dies. The Hawai'i worker is charged for setting a fire in an enclosed structure. I think 3 weeks or something like that. And these are the stories that the Hawaii Ho-Chi publishes that basically point out if you're white in Hawaii, given American law in the early 20th century, there is no way that you're going to get punished in any major way as long as you make sure that who you kill is someone who's Asian. If on the other hand you're Asian and do anything to anyone who's white, you're never going to see the outside of a prison for the rest of your life if they can manage to do it. So it's pointing out the total discrepancy between what US law said and what US law was doing. Now, to a certain extent, this should sound familiar because we want to think about it, Hawaii Ho-Chi could be seen as sort of in a much more focused form. Could be sort of seen as like the initial part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the fact that what you got is people saying that a particular group is being ostracized and is being picked upon and not given their legal rights vis-a-vis other groups. However, if you look at this in the case of the 1920s, one is what was going on was totally acceptable in the rest of the United States. Doing that to Asians was, in fact, he points out in a couple of stories, if you actually read the Hawaii Ho-Chi back in the period, which you can pick up online. There's actually a bunch of stories of for example, a group of Hawai'is that decide they don't like Chinese competition, so they literally surround them in a lumber camp in Southern Oregon and shoot 13 guys dead and just walk away and then brag about it. And no one's ever even arrested. There's a lynch mob in 1921 in San Francisco or something like that, where a bunch of drunks get together and hang 4 Chinese from lampposts in the middle of San Francisco. No one's arrested, nothing ever happens. So what you get is this total discrepancy between the idea that the American legal system is impartial and the reality of the legal system in the early 20th century, especially if you're Asian, in the case of here, especially tied to Hawaii because it's this Hawaii newspaper that's pointing this out. And the Ho-Chi offices get firebombed a couple of times. The editor who published and printed all the stuff is threatened several times. He actually gets shot once or twice. I can't remember exactly what. And one of the ironies is that the newspaper is up for the Pulitzer, which had just been started a couple of years earlier, which is supposed to be for superb journalism in the United States, which is sort of ironic if you think of where journalism came from in the U.S., especially Pulitzer. But by this time, it seems like the gold medal of real legitimate journalistic moral whatever. But of course they don't get it. And the reason that he doesn't get it would be for a very simple reason. Why did the Hawaii Ho-Chi not get the Pulitzer Prize in 1929 or 1930? First guess. You have to remember, this is a national prize.
I'll take a guess. I imagine that it would be kind of biased against anything that's reporting against the status quo.
Totally right. Yeah, they decided that the Pulitzer Committee decided you could not give awards to Asians. You basically couldn't give awards to non-white newspapers. Yep. Well, and so that ends up, that's the logic. So I don't get it. That's the United States, I would say, right into the 1950s. The U.S. mainland had this as an attitude. It never occurred to anyone to even challenge it.
I sliced through this school like a saw. Dude got in my way, sawed him. Set my sights on a chick, sawed him.
Someone's mic's open.
It would have been like a horror movie if I wasn't so awesome. That guy's gone now. I have a purpose to defend our great country with my superior willpower.
I was like, what kind of a class is that?
Michaela, I think your mic's open.
Except for maybe just one thing.
When does your class start? 11:20.
So, have you noticed how hot I look in the uniform?
So anywho's, so we'll stop with this. We'll see the next murder case because they're actually sequential, and you have to understand the first one to understand the second one.
I finished one.
So in the case of Hawaii, the Fukunaga case is hugely important.
Yeah.
The U.S. mainland, not near as much. So
Some potentials.
It's